Hey guys, and welcome back to another lesson. Today I'd like to show you how to create smooth flowing motions when playing the keyboard, and to do this I'm going to borrow some examples from the Beatles. Now without further ado, let's start by playing a C major chord, and I'm going to keep everything in the key of C just to keep things consistent and easy to follow. Now we're going to take this C major chord in the root position and just play the first two notes, which is kind of enough to give the listener a feel for the chord. You kind of know almost this is a C major chord just by hearing these two notes. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to plane this up the C major scale, meaning we're going to take this shape and just move it up the notes of the C major scale. That creates kind of a nice flowing motion. Now we're going to take this motion and we're going to modify it a little bit. We're going to take the lowest note and drop it down an octave. So now the motion becomes. You can almost hear the beginning of Blackbird here, right? Which is kind of neat. You can also think about the chords you're playing or implying by going through this motion, right? This, or actually this, is C major, probably. This is perceived as a D minor. This is either an E minor or a C major. This is probably an F major or implies an F major. This implies probably a G major, but maybe also an E minor. This would be an either A minor or F major. And this is likely a G major. And then a C major again. Now we're going to take this one step further by adding a pedal note to it. And a pedal note is simply a note that repeats throughout the changes that the motion creates. Usually the best pedal notes are either the root of the scale you're in, so in our case a C, or the fifth degree, which would be a G. We're going to pick a C. And now we're going to do the same motion. Just like this, but we keep the double octave C held down at all times. And this brings out this beginning of Blackbird even more strongly. Pretty cool. Now, of course, you can play pretty much anything you want. I mean, you can use this motion for your own purposes and just play around with it. It's really smooth sounding. Another thing that reminds you, or at least me, of the Beatles is which is the outline of this interim of Here Comes the Sun. Now we can take variations of this kind of motion. Remember what we did is we dropped the lowest note down an octave. We can also drop the highest note up an octave, which gives us a minor sixth, or a sixth more generally because it's going to change between a minor and a major, and move it up. Just like we did with the previous interval. And as before, we can add pedal notes. We're going to add these C's down here and doubling it up here. So again, you get this very nice flowing kind of motion. Now, just a little point before we move on, you'll see that as we move up, the last kind of chord we imply is a G, which then goes to a C. And that's kind of a strong resolution, a G to a C. I guess in theory terms you would call this a dominant resolving to the tonic. It's a little bit weaker going down, because the last pair here is a D minor, and that would be a subdominant going to the tonic. So one thing you can do is you can add, really, a G7 sus4 chord here before going back to, or resolving to, the initial C major. Just an observation that helps make this motion a little bit smoother. So you can have maybe something like this. Can we make this even more interesting? And the answer is yes, by incorporating chromatic motion. And so far what we've been doing is we've been planing. So we've been moving our shape within the C major scale, but this means that sometimes some of the notes would move by a semitone, sometimes by 2 semitones. Right? So from here to here, the E moves up by a semitone and the C moves up by 2 semitones. Well, from here to here, the D moves up by 2 semitones, the F by 2 semitones, and so on and so on. We can also incorporate chromatic motion, whereby we move our shape in semitones. So, and this usually works well when inserted between the kind of the basic motions that you see here. So for example, something like this. Instead of just doing this, you can do, and if you do the doubling and the octave moving that we've done before, we can do, let's say, let's take here. Instead of just doing this. Now we can, again, we can keep on going up, or we can keep on using chromatic motion. So move this like this, or and then like this, right? So this would be a D dominant 7, or an implied D dominant 7, because I'm not playing the D root, and then this can resolve to the G7 sus4 and to the C major. And this might sound familiar because this is really how the end goes, right? So you see, just by playing around with this kind of motion, we're already kind of following in the footsteps of the Beatles, which is really a pretty good indication that we're doing something right. Can we use other types of chromatic motion? Well, sure, of course. Let's see what we get if we keep on pushing this, right? So we did. Now, from here, what we can do is we can, I mean, there are many possibilities and you can play around with them. One thing we can do is move like this. And then, so from here, really we can think of this as going, instead of doing this motion, you're doing, so you're adding this kind of chromatic motion on the left hand before moving on to the next planing motion. And you can do this again. Instead of just moving or planing the shape up, you can also add another chromatic motion. And now you're really starting to replicate Blackbird, right? So planing, chromatic, planing, chromatic, planing, chromatic. We're within the C major scale, so I'll call this planing. So pay attention to what happens when we go down. We have an A minor, a C augmented, C major, F major, F minor, so kind of nice chromatic motion here. So instead of just doing something like this, you do a chromatic motion in between. Another chromatic motion like this to a D dominant 7, and then, as I've pointed out, a G7 sus4 and a C major. So again, just by playing around with these chromatic motions, you get these very pleasing sounds. Now, there are many other unexplored things that I haven't shown you. For example, let's say that you start from something like this, or maybe even something like this. You jump here, so you go from a C major to a C dominant 7, F major, F minor, C major, D dominant 7, G dominant 7 sus4, and C major. So instead of thinking in terms of the underlying harmony and complex theory rules, you can just arrive at some very interesting motion just by playing around with this, really. So this is kind of a very cool concept that can lead to very beautiful sounding motions, and you don't even need very deep theory to unlock it. That's it. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I will see you next time.